The next presenter is from Karolinska Development, the CFO and Investment Director, Aniansson. Karolinska Development is an investment company with extensive experience in research, development, financing and commercialization of pharmaceutical and medical technology projects focused on investments in innovation life science companies. Wonderful to see you here again, Per.
Thank you, Katarina. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So, I'm Per Aniansson, CFO and Investment Director at Karolinska Development. And I'm here to talk about Karolinska Development and why you might want to invest in life science and perhaps also in Karolinska Development. So I'll leave you to read this very quickly. And then, well, why should you invest in life science? It's really complex, and looking at the markets, I think it's gone down 67% biotech in the last 12 months. It's a bit scary. I think there are 23% of the companies in the US valued below cash. It's a very difficult market to be in. Having said that, if you know how to do this, you can actually have extremely good returns if you pick the right ones. And for instance, just an example, we're lucky enough to sell one of our portfolio companies by the end of last year, Forendo, almost at $1 billion valuation. That's biodollars, so it's a milestone deal, but still, we're really happy about that. So if you do pick the right ones, the upside is enormous. You all know this, but there are also really big risks. And I'll come into a bit how you can actually deal with that. And you need to avoid them because you do mistakes and you have to learn from them and you have to have the right people around you. So it's about controlling risk, basically. Also pick the right ones, of course. And another good idea is to have a diversified portfolio, which also brings down the risk because then you have several bets. And it's difficult to do that if you're a private investor or if you're not a specialized one, being able to have a portfolio. It helps to have experience as well. And people who have actually done investments in these stages understand the science, understand which people to bring in, and also have made all the mistakes earlier, ideally, so that you've learned from them so you don't do them again. So, to give you the background on Karolinska Development, we're an investment company. We're listed on Stockholm Nasdaq mid-cap. We invest in growth stage life science, both private and public. We come out of Karolinska Institute originally, so we're very well connected to Karolinska Hospital and the Karolinska Institute. We've built a very strong relationship there. Having said that, we do work with all the innovation hubs around the Nordics. We have a late-stage, first-in-class portfolio with significant inflection points coming up in the 2 to 4 years from now. We are looking at new investments, and when we go in, we'd like to be able to see an exit within 3 to 4 years. So we try to avoid to stay in for maybe 10 years or more, which is sometimes the case if you go into life science. So we make sure we really get into the phases where there's a possibility to get out within 3 to 4 years. We've done 10 exits or partial exits. We've listed 9 companies in the last 5 years. And we've actually been through kind of a transformational journey here since 5-6 years ago, when Victor is joined, who's here, we was on the panel before. The company kind of transformed from having invested in fairly early stage academic companies, really good ones, some of them, but it was a complicated model, and it shifted into a more pure venture capital type of investment model. So the portfolio has been refined. We now have 10 companies, which we believe very strongly in our portfolio. We've also raised money. In February, we succeeded with a rights issue of almost 400 million. We also sold Forendo, which I mentioned, so we have cash, so we're looking at new investments. We also have, in my mind, a very good team. We've increased the team with 2 new highly skilled persons. And we have a very strong owner in Invox Biopharmaceuticals, who've supported the company for 8 years now in a very good way. So just to look at what has happened these last 5 years. Well, the portfolio value has increased about 6 times. It's now just shy of 1 billion. We have made quite a lot of investments in our portfolio companies. We have invested 380 million ourselves. And with other specialist investors, there's a 3.5 billion has gone into the company in the last 5 years. We've made exits of a bit over 400 million. Among those, you see Forendo here in highlight, but there are quite a few others that's been good exits here. We've listed 9 companies. Recently, just 2 weeks ago, Promimic, a medtech company, which I'm happy to say was fully subscribed, even if in this quite tough market. And our balance sheet is now clean in the sense that there's no debt, which is also a good feeling. We've had quite a lot of debt from the history before, but now all that is gone. So what have we learned after 20 years of life science investments? Well, you need to look at where are the inflection points in value? When is the data coming out? When are the major things happening in the companies that would actually make it possible to sell the company or fund it with new, larger investors coming on board, perhaps international VCs or what have you. So you need to see that that can happen within 3 years, because if not, you will be stuck for a long time and you have to fund the company for a very long time. You need to set the right management in the team. First of all, of course, the founders, and then make sure that the team is complemented if needed. And then you need to bring in the right type of people on the boards. And then when I say the right people, it's exactly the right people who know what needs to be done to make this a successful company in the end. Ideally, it's someone who's already done a similar journey before in the same area. Just an example, Simon Cartmel, who came in as a chairman in OssDesign. He was the CEO of Apatec, who was successfully sold just a few years earlier before he joined us. And he's been into bone implantation for most of his life. And he's really been essential for OssDesign's success. And as I mentioned, you need to make sure you have financing to actually go beyond the next inflection points when you go in. If not, you'll have it in your knees and you have to fund it all yourself. It's also very important to have experience in the investment team, which I mentioned before, with in-depth life science experience. And then you bring in whatever extra expertise you need from the outside. So looking at the team, well, we have Victor here, who's the CEO. He's associate professor earlier at Karolinska in heart surgery, and then joined the dark side investments like 20 years ago, I think it is almost. And he was on SEB Venture Capital, heading up the life science investments there before he joined Karolinska Development. Myself, I've been in venture capital for over 20 years. Hopefully I've done most of the mistakes now, but probably not. Then we have John Öd, who is a doctor by training. He's a researcher, and then he went into the pharma industry. He's been with Shire and AstraZeneca for many years in pharma development. He's deeply knowledgeable in life science. You can bring up any subject and he'll give you a lecture on it. He's amazing in that sense. And he's also an entrepreneur. He's actually CEO for one of our portfolio companies in parallel here, Modus. Johan Dighed, who's he was a senior lawyer at SEB Banking for many years and worked a lot with SEB Venture Capital. He joined a couple of years ago and he's also experienced in making investments. And then we have two new members here, Linda and Michaela, who they've both, Linda has a PhD from Karolinska, and she's been at Boston Consulting Group for many years as a senior consultant and analyst, therefore, in life science. She was also CEO for a medtech company before joining us. And Michaela, she's been with Boston Consulting Group for 5-6 years, I think, so totally dedicated on life science. Then we have a long list of experts that we bring into the companies and sit on our boards and so on. So it's all about networking, really. Very briefly on some of our investments, I mentioned Forendo. You might have heard about BioArctic, Aprea, which was mentioned earlier by Victor, cancer research company we listed in the US, Xspray. I won't go into the details here, but there are some fine companies that come out from Karolinska over the years. So this is maybe the core of our business, apart from looking at new investments. These are the ones we engage with on a daily basis, more or less. We always sit on the board of these companies. We're very active. We talk to the CEO, and we help out with wherever we can. And I won't go into detail on all of these, but just a quick run through. Aprea I mentioned, it's oncology. Modus is sepsis. Hopefully we'll have a nice readout of phase 1 later this year. We have Dilafor, which is perhaps the one which we hope to be able to exit near term. We'll see. We're waiting for additional phase 2 data coming out later this year. And when we get to this stage, just as in general, we do engage special corporate finance firm specialized in exactly the area that the company is, who knows how to sell this to the big pharma. As an alternative, we look at listing the companies. So it's a dual track always to kind of try to maximize the exit. And then we have Umicrine, which we have a very strong belief in, very interesting data already came out, and we're now going into later phase 2 studies. They've shown also quite interesting data on neuroinflammation, which might broaden up the indication areas here. But mainly they're looking at liver diseases at the moment. Then we have Svenska Vaccinfabriken, which is a vaccine company. Maybe not so common, but they actually have therapeutic vaccines. They're focusing on hepatitis B and D, which is very major diseases, as you might know, and this is actually potentially a way to treat hepatitis B and D. They also have a COVID-19 vaccine. The interesting thing with that vaccine is that it doesn't go on the spike thing on the virus, so it actually goes onto the virus itself, and it potentially could be efficient towards future mutations of COVID-19, which I think we should expect that we will see. Anacardio is also one of the companies where we see hopefully a shorter journey for us. It looks really promising, and we're now going into phase 2 studies soon here. It's in heart failure, which is one of the biggest diseases we have to treat in the world. Biosurgeon is more of a passive investment. We're not active in that company, although we think it's a highly interesting company. We then have 2 medtech companies at the moment. One is, and you might have heard about them, OssDesign has been on the stock exchange for some while. Bone implants for the skull and also for the spine now. It's really an interesting material which actually transforms into bone, a ceramic that transforms after 18 months or so into bone. So it's extremely innovative, and they're now scaling up in the US. Promimic is a coating on implants as well, which helps fixing the bones into the body in a much better way. And they're now scaling up in the US. So those are in commercial phases So what is then our investment strategy? Well, we look at the Nordics mainly. We can go outside if there are good partners investing with us, also internationally. So we do look outside the Nordics. On the left-hand side here, you see the typical VC model, which is early mid-stage companies. That means in pharma, it's when they go into clinical phase 1 or 2, normally we would look at. And in medtech, we would normally look at companies where they're in the commercial phase, where they started to have some revenue, maybe about 10, 20 million or so in revenue. That's our focus when we engage. And then we help these companies to develop further. On the right-hand side, it's more an opportunistic strategy we have, where we look at public companies as well. And there are quite a few, as you know, on First North, there are lots of interesting biotech companies, and some of those will and have come into problems with financing, but although they are potentially very interesting. And we look at all those companies, and we might go into some of those as well. It's not a big difference really to be public or non-public today in our mind. We're used to that. So, and we think there will be more and more opportunities in this downturn in the markets now. So venture investment in public equity, VIPE stands for. Crossover is something which is a big thing in the US, not so much here. You do see it. It's more, you go in pre-IPO, and you kind of, as a specialist investor, you validate this company so that they have a better chance of succeeding with the IPO. And then you can come in at a fairly good valuation, and you can get out within maybe 2-3 years from there. So this is where we look at the companies when you think about stage. In area, drug discovery is really the core, where we focus mainly and where we have most of our expertise. But we do look at medtech and digital health. And I myself is more focused on the medtech and the digital health parts. There's a lot of interesting things happening in our area within digital health, since we have a thriving tech community we're fairly advanced in software, as you know, and combining that with healthcare and development and so on is really an interesting combination. So we see quite a lot of highly interesting companies there. It's taking some time, but now they mature, so we see that it works. So in summary, we have a diversified portfolio with diversification. Basically, if you invest in Karolinska development, you get into a bunch of companies with an inflection point quite near term in all those companies, most of them within 2 to 4 years. So it's a fairly mature portfolio. We have a very experienced team. We have a lot of exits already as a track record, and we know how to do the exits and to actually negotiate the good deals with the pharma companies. We have quite unique deal sourcing from our connections over the 20 years here, with collaborating with both corporate finance and investors and academia and entrepreneurs and so on. It takes time to build those networks, and so we have several companies every day coming into our deal flow, where we select carefully and finally choose a few, very few ones. We invest maybe 1 to 4 per year in new companies. That's our strategy. And we have a strong backer in Invox Biopharmaceuticals. So I'm opening up for questions there, maybe.
Well, thank you very much, Per. I'm curious, and maybe some people, some in the audience are too. You mentioned exit 3 to 4 years. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate on why these specific age brackets?
Well, it's always a target, and you might not end up there. But when we go in, we want to see that that's possible. And if you invest in a company which is in after phase 1, for instance, and need to do a phase 2A, which is a smaller type of phase 2 development phase, that normally takes 1 to 2 years to accomplish. And if that data looks good, that is often, if the area is interesting enough, the market is big enough, that is when the big pharma will start looking at you and actually might buy you, which we've seen in several of our companies. Sometimes you need to take it a bit further, but ideally we try to sell after phase 2A, you could say. Sometimes it happens even after phase 1, but then we're taking it into phase 1, and if it's a really first-in-class, highly meeting high needs of treatment and big market and all that, you can actually sell them already after phase 1. So that makes it possible to, even in pharma, get out within, well, 3 to 4 years, ideally. In medtech, you need to get in when they're commercial, and then you need to scale them up to 1 to 200 million Swedish or so in revenue. Alongside you build partnerships, and then you might be able to sell it somewhere there. And that normally takes, well, could take a bit more actually, 3 to 5 years, I would say, at least there.
Well, thank you for explaining. If you look into a broader perspective of life sciences, what sectors do you think will be booming, let's say within 5 years?
Well, as a venture capital investor, you need to see where are the big pharma looking? Where do they think it's interesting to be? So because we need to be able to sell to them. So that kind of governs where we look as well, and we kind of look where might they want to look in the future. So that governs a lot where we look. But in general, I mean, there are some areas which have been hot for a long time and will remain to be hot. Like oncology is still very high up on the agenda. You have neuroinflammation, which is a very tricky area, but high unmet needs medically. But going away from these obvious large indications or areas, myself, I'm looking at digital health, for instance. I think there's so much we can do with the new technologies coming on board, the sequencing we talked about earlier, in diagnostics or companion diagnostics, or also in where you can optimize the patient pathways and the care. Actually, there are so many ways to improve the quality of care and also quality for the patients with the help of tools and artificial intelligence as well. And we see really interesting companies coming out there actually building revenue as well with models that work. Then we get into more tech-like investments with less capital intense and shorter development times as well, which is quite good to combine with what we're doing here. We understand the healthcare systems, and we apply that knowledge to also bringing in other technologies, for instance. Other areas which I think is quite interesting is where there's a big need is on antibiotics, which is a very difficult area. But having said that, when we dig into it, the need is so high. It's one of our biggest challenges with the resistant bacteria in the world. And as you might know, there is a blacklist of the ones that will actually kill more people than in cancer and so on in the coming years. This problem won't go away, and we need to deal with it. And there is willingness from governments and authorities and industry and so on to actually solve this problem. And we see now that the things are falling in place, also in the reimbursement systems and so on, to make it possible to actually make good investments also in antibiotics. Another area tied to that is probiotics, which is it's been around for 10, 15 years, but it's just at the start. And there's so many things we don't really know yet, and finding some new interesting medical treatment things with probiotics, I think is also, it's maybe not the best timing now because things will happen, but it's an area I believe a lot in the future, for instance. It's just some examples.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your expertise, Per. Thank you.
Thank you.